Welcome to HistoricHole. My name is David, and I'm joined by Otto. And this week we're going to do a discussion about Machiavelli.
All right.
And so, yeah, if you're not familiar with the show, we've had Otto on here a few times. And, he's cool. He's a good friend of mine. So we're just going to see what he thinks about some of the conclusions and interpretations of Machiavelli's works. Which sounds super fucking exciting, I'm sure.
Oh, it's interesting, all right. At least a little bit I've been reading up on it, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's, basically, give you a general idea. People can kind of consider him to be like the godfather of political science, like modern political science. But he lived from 1469 to 1527. So obviously, quite a ways back. Not really necessarily what we would consider a modern person, right? By our typical standard. But what's interesting is a lot of what he talks about can be applied to what happens today in some of those environments, political, business, really any organization that has a structure of leadership.
Right, a power structure.
Yeah. So that's what's really interesting, I find, about what he talks about a lot of times. And that's why I think people consider him relevant today. Thing is, though, is like people do, I think, misread sometimes his points, because oftentimes when you hear the term Machiavellian, right? Somebody's it kind of just devious, right?
There's a negative connotation for sure.
Yeah, it's like pejorative. So it's like, oh, it's really Machiavellian. He's really opportunistic, or he's really just, it's, yeah. It's not a good, you don't basically, unless you're like a sociopath, right? Like you don't want to be called Machiavellian. But I think that's kind of a misinterpretation of what he's talking about. So, it's hard to know really where to start with him, but I guess I'll just give you a little bit of background in like the political atmosphere of the time. So he's living in Florence. He's a Florentine. He's which is an Italian city-state. You have several Italian city-states which Rome founded. You have other city-states. You have Venice, a couple others I can't remember off the top of my head right now, because they're not really important to our story necessarily. But some of the conflict between those are. So anyway, at the time when he was born, there was a ruling family in Florence, the Medici family. So Cosmo De Medici was basically the ruler of the republic, but it was kind of a surface level republic, because Cosmo De Medici sort of meddled in the appointments of the officials in the government, right? So a republican form of government back then was defined as mixture of elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. So at the time, you had those different forms of government manifest, obviously, in the Middle Ages, right? You have monarchies, you have kings ruling. He references democracy. Obviously, Greeks had democracy, Romans, republic. So he's a republican thinker. He considers himself a republican in the terms of like, he's like, this is what we need for Florence. At the time of his birth, Cosmo de Medici is in power of the republic, right? So it was a mixture of those forms of government. It was a mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But again, it was only surface level, because Cosmo de Medici was meddling in sort of, I guess, the democratic elements of that republican government. Once Cosmo de Medici dies, falls out of power, his son takes over, I believe, for 5 years, and then his grandson, Lorenzo, takes over. But then his son then takes over after his death, and they are ousted from Florence.
This is all within like
his early
life.
Yeah, this is all during his early life. And the reason this is relevant is because once they're ousted, once the Medici family's ousted, there's a new government that comes in, a new republic that is founded with the help of the French. And this government is where Machiavelli gets a job, and has a government post. And so he obviously learns some stuff working for the government. And his time there, he has some observations about things. And I believe this obviously influences his works that he writes after this, because his works that are done after his job here. So the Medici come back into power, though. in 1512, I believe. At that point, he loses his job. He's actually imprisoned briefly, but then he goes into a voluntary exile in his family's estate in southern Florence. At that point, he writes The Prince and discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, which Livy is a Roman historian. At that point, this is where he writes what he's most well known for. And so we can talk about The Prince mainly is like his most well-known work. Like the other one actually is referencing the Roman historian. So he's talking about the Republic a lot more, that form of government. With The Prince, he's talking about principalities. Because at the time in Florence, once the Medici come into power, this is almost like some people consider it almost like a work of flattery. He's trying to tell them, hey, this is how you should do it. You know, this is how you should rule Florence. All right, we need some strong leadership here. He's trying to lay sort of the groundwork of how you need to govern in a city-state. Depending on, you know, how you feel about politics and stuff, sometimes this may not be that interesting. We're talking a little bit right now about some of the dates and names, right? So some of that is a little boring, but it's important to get a little bit of context. So like, stuff. I just wanted to lay some groundwork so people sort of understand the time, sort of understand the political situation and what Machiavelli experienced, what he went through, because that informed what he was writing about. Mm-hmm. The Prince goes into a lot of different things. We're not going to cover everything in super great detail, but one of the most important things was his discussion of new principalities and how to deal with those, because he talks about sort of two main ones: a hereditary principality, one that you inherit. You know, so we think about this to draw a parallel today. It's not an apples to apples comparison to today, but think about, you know, a district, a voting district that's like heavily one way or the other, right? Okay. So it's like heavily blue, heavily red. And so there's already sort of a power structure there that supports whoever is going to be sort of anointed as the successor to whoever holds that seat, because a lot of these seats can be held, you know, for decades by some of these people, especially in the House. I mean, actually both. I mean, Senate and House, people hold those seats forever. So,
which is ridiculous.
Yeah. And so, but so you think about it, like some of these, you know, you inherit, if you're inheriting a principality, and this, I think this can be applied today, is, you know, you don't have to be necessarily, Machiavelli argues, you don't have to necessarily be like exceptional. You don't have to be like great. You just need to not rock the boat that much. You know, it's like you need to keep things consistent. That's what people like. They like security and consistency. Okay. And so if you come in, you're inheriting principality. If you start changing things around and start delegating power in a lot of different ways, and things change, like that starts to worry people. Things are different. If you come in and you start raising taxes a lot, you know, people are going to be like, okay, well, what the heck's going on right now? You know, there's certain things you have to balance. And so, you know, just to touch on the hereditary one real quick, but he talks about new principalities, and this is really more interesting, I think, because it's talking about coming into a new territory, right? One that you don't necessarily own, something that you've conquered.
Okay.
You know, how do you treat that? Well, Machiavelli says two main situations that you'll encounter are, is it a similar culture to yours? Well, if it is, then you can get rid of the ruling family. Like, you can basically just wipe them out, you know, exile them, just get them out of the country, you know, because you don't want people to start, you know,
rallying.
Yeah, exactly. You know, a rival government pop up, you know, within the country. That's the last thing you need. Just get them out of there. He says if it's a similar enough culture to yours, because then you can come in, there won't be that much change, right? It's just a new ruler at the top. Most people, the masses, he says, are less fickle, you know, than the nobility. Those are the people that you really have to worry about. So if you're coming in, you know, you just be added to the nobility in a similar culture to yours. You need to keep them happy. You need to just get the rulers out, you know, keep the nobility happy, keep things consistent. You should be all right. Make friends, you know, with them. Make friends with the nobility. That's really a main thing that you want to do, is have allies. So the other situation he talks about is a different culture, you know, something that's pretty foreign from your own. You can't necessarily come in there and start making a big change like that. He says it's okay to keep the ruling family around in that situation. It's you kind of want to then just sort of you treat that a little more delicately. You need somebody that understands the culture to sort of keep the day-to-day running properly. So it's a little harder in that situation to gain maybe trust of nobles, because they might not culturally want the same things that people in a similar culture would, right? So it might be harder to make friends with them, because the cultural difference is too great. And not necessarily, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's the hurdles you have to get over in order to cultivate a friendship are too great. Not necessarily harder just because your culture is different.
So like, the idea is not really like a rule by fear. It's more like, don't ruffle feathers. I mean, get what you need to get out the way. But use what you need to use.
Well, yeah. So, what the fear does come in. Like, it is not necessarily, not to jump too, because, we are getting to that. Like,
okay.
The fear needs to be used in a certain way. You can't, some people make mistakes by being too brutal. You start to push people too hard and they push back. That's a pretty consistent rule. It's pretty consistent throughout history.
Yeah.
You're too easy on people, things start to descend into chaos. They start disrespecting your rule. They're not going to take you seriously. So when you give a direct order, they're going to laugh at you, because why should I obey?
You're not
going to punish me. Like, so there needs to be some, he says, and Machiavelli like stresses this so hard, and this is what makes him kind of, he's a Renaissance thinker. Renaissance meaning rebirth. It was these guys looking to the past, the ancient times. They really kind of gloss over the Middle Ages, because it's it's really a dark period, right? There's a lot of suppression of intellectual curiosity during that period, right? There's a lot of faith in the church and in the rule of the monarchy. So they look to Rome, they look to Greeks, they look to Persia, they look to the Ottomans, they look to these great empires of the past and how things worked there. And that's what informs Renaissance thinkers, and sort of that's what informs the people that go on to write the Constitution, the United States and all this stuff. It's like all of it's connected, right? All of this stuff about, ruling and rights and power delineations and how people should be treated, how you should interact with the public. All of this does matter. And Machiavelli, obviously, you look at this stuff, like what he does specifically in The Prince and the Discourses is looks at past examples, pulls them and compares them with contemporary stuff going on in his time. And it's like, look, this isn't exactly the same thing, but you can see contextually the similarities. So
right, how it applies.
He really stresses context and context, and also doing this sort of comparative like criticism of things. This is establishing kind of like, this is what we do now. This is what like kind of universities, like just the intellectual tradition of Western civilization is sort of founded on all of this stuff. And he's one of the first guys to sit down and say, hey, how are things actually versus how should they be? Because you look in ancient times, people are talking about how should things be. That's why you have religion, and you have like the Bible and books that are informing how people should behave, right? Like a code to live your life. Like how should things be? Machiavelli's saying, no, well, like this is how it is. We're not talking about how it should be.
So a bit of an expose.
So it's not necessarily like the Bible where it's like, thou shalt not kill because, it's 10 commandments. God says you shouldn't do it, right? It's not a moral thing. He's applying sort of like, that's why we say political science, right? He's sort of applying a method. He cites an example of coming into a situation of a culture that's largely different than yours, and it being hard to conquer because of that, right? Like it's hard to make your allies, right? It's hard to find your way in. But once you do that, it's pretty easy to hold that then, as long as following these rules of not rocking the boat too much there, doing enough to be respected. Yeah, to the point that you were talking about, like the fear, he's saying, he's looking at history, he's looking at all of this stuff and saying the examples of people just applying just enough pressure to get respect works. You don't have to go overboard with it, but you just need to do just enough. He cites some examples in the discourses of a Roman ambassador going to Gaul and mistreating the Gauls, them being upset about it, and when nothing was done to this ambassador as punishment, the Gauls attacked Rome and took over, which was the last time that actually happened for like 800 years, I believe. He also cites an example, which is from Greek times. There's King Philip II of Macedon. So Alexander the Great's dad. There's a situation with one of his guards, Attalus. He raped a man named Pausanias, and Pausanias wanted King Philip to do something about this. King Philip did nothing, and Pausanias ended up assassinating King Philip.
As opposed to the booty bandit.
As opposed to the guy who killed. We'll see. King Philip was the one that had the responsibility to punish, right? It was up to him, and when he didn't do that, Pausanias took offense. It was like this. You see examples of this throughout history. There's a certain honor to leadership, right? It's like they respect that leadership so much, and when they don't follow through with discipline, when they don't apply the pressure when they should, people then don't respect that rule, and then you end up, in this situation, obviously, kill the king. And in the situation with the Roman ambassador, you can, take over Rome. And another thing that he brings up about, as a prince, you should not be hated. Like, you need to avoid that. Like, and that's where the kind of brutality comes in. If you're too hard on people, people will hate you. And when that happens, it's just hard to get them back on your side. And you can see that too play out in modern politics, right? It's just like if you push too hard and people hate you, and there's a visceral response to your leadership, then it's hard to get people on your side, and they will turn against you.
I mean, I could think of like a more so like recent example of that, and then this is just on the strength of me like watching Narcos recently. But like, if you know anything about the whole like Escobar story, like a big part of him just being able to get away with what he got away with, you know what I'm saying, in Colombia, legit was just simply because like he won the people over. Like they loved him in that city. Yep. Like he would always be out and about handing people money, building neighborhoods for poor people, blah, 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 blah. He did all of that quote unquote legwork back in the day, to where people loved him so much that like as hard as the cops tried, he always got help getting away. Yep. The city always looked out for him up until he got too murderous, up until he was just bombing whatever, wherever, however. As soon as the people realized, oh man, I mean, we could say Escobar this, Escobar that, but he's killing, anybody and everybody willy-nilly. As soon as Colombia turned on him, he was done.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? That's all it took.
Yep. No, exactly. No, it's like the people really, that's a great segue into another point that he brings up. It's like really power can be obtained through two ways: through the consent of the nobility or the consent of the people. And so, basically, you have to have one of them on your side, because, the nobility will respect the mob,
Facts. I think, the nobility can lead you to the mob also. If you think about it in contemporary terms, like if you gain celebrity support, the right way, so to speak, I feel like that sways a lot of people this day and age anyway.
Yeah, I mean, organically, you mean like just like, you gain support just by, being out there and doing the work.
Yeah, but like having...
Because like nobility obviously will elevate their puppets, to try and get the people, to fool the people, to get them on their side, and they can just control them. That's one thing that he talks about here too, is you have to be careful of nobility. You have to watch out for them. They're dangerous, and like they see you as their equal because they
as a tool,
exactly, to control. And so that's also another big part of the prince. And you can also see how a lot of this applies today, because it's not apples to apples, but you think about any level of government or elected office, any leadership, you have to gain the approval of nobility of some sort. Whether if it's a local office, it's probably the wealthy business owners in the area, the ones that are needing to use the government, for permits or whatever. They have some need where it's like, look, I need you to be on my side so I can keep doing my business smoothly. Average people, your average, everyday person, probably not going to need that level of attention that your nobility would need. And, obviously, living in a voting district, I don't know my representative. Obviously have never seen them or talked to them, but they're obviously around doing work, and they serve somebody.
Exactly. I was about to say, so who are they working for?
But, it's at the same time, I have not sought them out either. So to be fair, to them.
You need to put a lot of money into a lobbyist's hands.
Oh, of course. Exactly. There's ways I could do it. But yeah, exactly. The main way would be I would have to have money, and
exactly.
It would happen a lot quicker than if I don't. I would be able to probably do it if I go to some campaign events or campaign stops. Right. But then it's very superficial there. Yeah, if I want to get in the room with somebody to make something happen, like there's ways to do that. And it's still the same thing. And this is what he's talking about back then. It's how you make allies. It's like pay people off. It's just like, talk to people, tell them, you're not necessarily you can't promise people too much. Like, you don't do that. Don't let your mouth write checks that your ass can't cash. You don't start saying people will get all of this stuff. Like, and that's what you see going on now with politics, is like people have problems when people are like, oh, well, like we're going to have like universal income. It's like everybody's going to get a check. And it's just like, you see this applies here. It's like, don't make those promises, right? It's just like, you should run on the merits of doing some like maybe programs to explore those ideas. I'm not necessarily opposed to those ideas, but I'm saying I don't think coming out of the gate and applying that across the board is necessarily a good sell. If you want to get people on your side, you probably need to talk about it more in conceptual terms.
Be more realistic, honestly.
Exactly. Don't make the promises that you can't keep. And you see the wisdom here. And it's really incredible, because you look at the environment now, and like, like we're talking about, and like, there's all sorts of promises people are making that they can't keep at all, and it's happening all over the place, and it's almost out of control. You know what I mean?
I mean, if you consider,
there's so much wisdom in what he's saying here.
Well, so the same man also basically hints at and implies, if not straight up says, that there shouldn't be like any move that's too low or too high, for you as a prince to achieve what you need to achieve. Like, as low as your enemies go, he implies you being able to do that same amount of dirt, or as righteous as people stand, he implies that you do what you need to do to achieve your goals. I mean, I feel like that's very blatant, so I'm not surprised that contemporarily there's a lot of this stupidity going on, because again,
it's the same thing,
right? The blueprint basically says, hey, if Jimmy is willing to go pay Susan and blackmail John to win, you should be willing to, go pay them both off, or whatever, the inverse of that would be. You should be, be blackmailing all three of them, or all three of them and then the families to get you the upper hand. And I feel like that's why, like, some people will like apply like the negative connotation to his work, so to speak. But again, like you were saying earlier, it's more of like an expose on both sides of that coin, as opposed to just like, advising one side. It's just basically saying, this is what's happening. This is literally what everyone does. And if you want to play the game to win.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting, like, about what you're saying there. It's like, he did, write this. A lot of people obviously read this, in context as like he was almost applying for a job with the Medici, who were in power. He lost his job. He comes and writes this book, and he's like basically saying, it's like, hey, this is how you should do things. I have some knowledge here. I worked in the government. I've read Livy. I have a lot of knowledge. Please use this. And he even like dedicates, I think, the book to one of, because they had a Medici Pope at the time as well. Okay. There's also some context there that I kind of glossed over. The Italian city-states were kind of divided at the time between their loyalty to the Pope, the Vatican, or the Holy Roman Emperor. So you had two entities there that were kind of controlling the different city-states, or kind of had allegiance.
Were they the different at loggerheads, or was it more of like a cohesive, but still split powers?
I mean, they were obviously, things were stable. Like you have, stable. The Medici are kind of popping in and out there. I mean, it's obviously stable enough for people to attain jobs and work and live a semi-consistent lifestyle. But there is definitely division, though, between support politically in social and civic life between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. So that's just some additional political context to the period. Not necessarily important to what we're talking about, but just in terms of like, he did pass this work off to somebody to give to I believe it was the Medici Pope. What you're saying though is accurate. It's just like, in a sense, him doing all of this work himself may have not have thought about it as like sort of like some kind of this academic exercise, but it ultimately became that and revealed a ton about how people operate. And he argues like this is a big thing. The big thing about it is an delineation between personal and political morality. He says personal morality is different. Like
very.
He's like, on a personal level, being Mr. Honest, being, like a guy, that's very honest, trustworthy, is not necessarily going to translate that well. He's not saying be devious all the time.
He's definitely not.
He's not saying that. What he is saying though is just, in order to maintain your power and consistency, sometimes those rules do bend. So that does mean sometimes being dishonest, sometimes being harsh, sometimes being cruel. To stress to people not to break certain rules that threaten the power structure that maintains the consistency of the republic. When you start getting into later thinkers like, Marx and people that talk about, they fucking talk about power structures and shit, right? It's like a big thing that they focus on, and talking about how people are affected by power structures. Like it's funny because some of this stuff, it's all connected, in an intellectual thread. But you see here how Machiavelli is just totally invested in the state, right? He's invested in the republic. He believes in the republic as a form of government. He's like, this is the best thing that we've come up with so far. Like pure monarchies aren't, those don't work. No. Just an aristocracy being ruled by the elite, that doesn't work either. The masses suffer. And then, mob rule also doesn't work. Like we can't be at the whims of the masses either. Like there needs to be a balance between all of these things. There does need to be somebody that just makes a final fucking decision at the top, but there also needs to be consideration by the elites, and there also needs to be consideration by the people. And it's just like, you see how like the evolution of this idea turns into what we have now, kind of like with this sort of representative democracy, and
fake democracy, for sure.
Yeah. And so like you see how it evolves over time, the idea, and like how the founding fathers use that in their formulation of government. You see people now talk about, it's like billionaires, they have way too much power, and it's like, hey, there may be some merit to that argument.
No, it applies if you take into account what he's saying, the reality of that situation and that context is. It speaks for itself, because again, you understand that there's like a certain level of ruthlessness, and like there's really no bottom line, nor is there a ceiling to like what can, should, and will be done.
Oh yeah, exactly. He's saying context is the whole thing. It's like, put everything into context. Mm-hmm. Whatever situation you're in, you can't look at what I'm saying here and just be like, okay, yeah, this applies, I'm going to do exactly this. He's like, you need to consider the entire context of your situation. He's like, hey, if you find those parallels, great. then you should be able to extrapolate from that, from what I'm saying. But, you're not going to find those examples. You're not going to be able to just be like, okay, well, if this, then that. He's like, there's too many factors in all of these situations, So he says, in order to really make these decisions, you really got to know history. You study history extensively. That's what you got to do as a good prince. A good prince needs to know history. He also goes into stuff. He talks about battle tactics and stuff too, obviously military stuff, where it's just like, well, you gotta make sure things are ready to go. A good prince explores the land. He rides the land. He goes on hunts. He knows the surrounding areas, right?
Right.
He knows his way around. So in case you don't want to start having to learn this stuff once you're under attack. Know your surroundings. He also says, plan stuff out, prepare. Just because the last thing you want to be doing is preparing when the people are on your doorstep. So, he covers a ton of stuff in this book, that really just deals with kind of ruling. And some of it is like stuff that really, like we can really pull political conclusions from. Okay. And some of this other stuff is kind of more, obviously a little dated, comes from, the time period, obviously.
Right. Applies more so there than.
Yeah.
All right. No, I mean, it helps to understand the current climate. It really does. That's why I'm kind of glad, you wanted to do this, because just like the little bit of like back work that I did on this was like, oh, okay. I'm sure you remember us talking before about just like, my whole take on like politicians and just that whole like, context of like, yeah, most of them, start out decent people who want to actually make a change, make a difference, do the right thing, blah, 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 blah. But then, once you get on the track and you're trying to run that race, you realize that like, you do need that person on the side with the water bottle. You do need that person handing out, the muffins or the power bars or whatever, i.e. you do need sponsors. You do need somebody's hands in your pockets, basically. And like, generally that's not necessarily like the best thing,
Yeah. Yeah. And like, and there's, that's the whole thing, like, about these conversations, right? Is this stuff is the foundation of that. Like a lot of what he talks about in the Prince and also in the discourses is like the foundation for this discussion, right? It's like, so, how do we balance all of that? How do we balance these? Because the people that are, you're saying like, that generally corrupt politicians, right? This is the guys that come with the big bucks, the big donations. We're going to fund your campaigns. We're going to give you this, that, and the other. These guys are the modern day nobility. These are the people that they see you as their equal or even perhaps their puppet, somebody that they can use for their own gain.
For further means. Yep.
Being a good leader means understanding those things. Good prince, right? Plays it close to the chest. He'll see that and perhaps play those guys, play them for fools. Maybe string them along thinking that they think he's in their pocket when
it's the other way around.
He gets into power, slaps them with some regulations, then all of a sudden he's got control over them. And so it's one of those, right? So it's one of these things where it's like, if you're going to get into that world, it doesn't matter, big or small, you need to know Machiavelli. Right. You need to know what he's talking about here and when to be brutal. Now, you slap them with those regulations, kind of give them a little hurt, then you ease up on them a little bit, right? And, it's like you show them some mercy and you're like, all right, I have to do these things. And then maybe it plays really great with the environmentalist crowd, right?
Exactly.
Boom. You get great press for that. And then you have the people on your side. And then you see the nobility are like, you tell them like, look, it's a win-win here. Mm-hmm. I'm doing well with the people, and it was just kind of a surface level move because like you hurt a little bit, but
you'll be all right.
You'll be okay because I put this thing buried here in the regulation, right? It expires in X amount of years, blah, 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 right? So, there's all sorts of these games. Like, it's all fucking horse trading, and anybody that's playing these games knows fucking Machiavelli, and they're playing, and a lot of this stuff is, like Machiavelli's talking about here, it's just not surface level. There's so much of this is understanding context and how people will react to things and the incentives people follow.
Okay, can we relate this a little bit to China at all? As far as how they run their how they run their operation or how they do their thing, because I feel like that's more of just totalitarian, just like, nah, just shut up and do what we say. And like, I don't want to say they're 100% like fear mongers, but if I remember, like, if I remember the talking points correctly, like, basically they kind of have this like what's it called? Social media credits.
A social credit score.
Yeah, social credit score and stuff, where like basically it affects your economic like viability.
Yeah, they're like judging you basically on your like how you are viewed socially is becoming commodified. Yeah, it's interesting. So it's like basically how in line you are, I guess, in agreeance with the state, perhaps. I don't know how they sell it over there. That's the thing, and that's what's so creepy about it. Like, they might be selling this in a way that's not like, oh, believe in the totalitarian government, right? Or believe in the authoritarian government. It's like
they work that whole like honor angle and shit. But.
Yeah, and they work exactly. They work it sort of at an angle. And like you think about here, like there's so many people that argue for things and for all sorts of stuff that is detrimental to themselves that they don't even understand, and they don't even understand why, and but they want it, and it's bad, but. And so I see that behavior here, and I'm like, well, it's no wonder they can do this in China. It's no wonder they can convince masses of people to just follow like awful trends, because like we look at it here, it's like already happening. It's almost like they're test running it here, like just trying to see if they can overwhelm people enough to the point where enough people are just pushing aggressively everybody in a social direction that is desired by the people in power, so then because that's the whole thing, is controlling people, and that's what it's always that's
what it boils down.
You look at these elements, right? We look at the monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. We look at the people controlling that, the democratic element. I mean, God, if you can control that, well, shit, you got,
That's true. I mean, that's everything. True power.
So, they love China. Obviously people love China because, you can control, it's like there's no suspense on like who's going to fucking win the election. It's like, well, obviously the party in power, there's a single party state, it's like the party in power is going to win. So, there's no suspense. And here there is some, and it would really help, people, the nobility, if they knew which way the people were going to go on things ahead of time, because then they could, make their bets, economic bets on
hedge those
all this stuff, and that's kind of how all this works. And that's why you see so much invested in controlling the democratic elements of this country. And that's why people are so freaked out about like, elections and,
So at that point, can you really call it a democratic system if there's so many like,
I don't know.
You know what I'm saying? There's so many attacks on that exact context.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, man, because I wouldn't know how you could study that necessarily. Maybe like actually quantify or figure out how much voting is actually affected by like the money that's put in by these big entities. I don't know if there's a way to actually do that. But I mean, there is, you look at there was this article a lot of people pointed to about the 2020 election. They were writing about how a bunch of the country's elite institutions and companies came together to fortify the election or something. And
whatever that means.
And everybody was like really bothered by that, or not, I don't want to say everybody, but like, a lot of people on the right were really, and you have different factions of that. We're really bothered by this line because it seemingly implies that they were doing something to influence the democratic element of the election, if they fortified it. It's like, well, this is kind of odd language to use. I guess they were trying to imply that they were protecting the democratic element. But like anytime you hear kind of that language being used, it is kind of raises eyebrows when it's the nobility kind of getting involved. It's like, look, you have your access to the government through lobbyists. Like that's how you get what you want.
Keep it
that's where you should do it. Like, don't fuck with the democratic element. Don't fuck with the people's element, because, again, you start pushing people to desperation, then bad things start to happen. And then people start running into the fucking Capitol. Yeah, don't do that. Keep it in the lobbyist realm. And obviously people have issues with lobbyists. There's tons of issues with lobbyists.
Get me started.
But again, there's a pressure valve. You need a pressure valve, right? You can't have no nobility. There's always going to be nobility. There's always people with money. There's always people with wealth. There's people with land. There's people with all sorts of shit. And they need to know how they can maintain it and keep it. And some of them want more. And so they all, are trying to find different ways to make all of their little schemes happen.
Yeah, dude. I mean, in the same way,
you need a pressure valve, because they're going to find a fucking illicit way to do those things if you don't have a system in place. But again, there's a lot wrong with the lobbying system in this country that needs to be fixed. But that's not to say that the lobbying is in and of itself a bad thing, because it is necessary, as we can see here.
It's a necessary tool. It's just being used by the, it's kind of like the wrong people, I feel like, are able to utilize it maximally, and then the right people who should be able to use that for effect, so to speak, don't get to, or at least they can't afford to, or at least they can't afford the good lobbyists to, have the right effect for them.
And we always talk about this outside of the podcast, but education being the key just to all of it. As people, at the popular element of the dynamic was educated enough, and we were able to stop fighting over things that seemingly a lot of times are almost
monuments are important. Okay.
Things that are almost like carrots that are dangled to get people mad. And it's, to me, they're distractions, because if we just focused on educating ourselves about these dynamics and what people, as a people, our power extends beyond the vote. Our power is economic as well. What we spend our money on matters. Now, not to sound too fucking preachy and get too idealistic, but as a people, if a people in any populace, not even just necessarily today, but in the past, they get aware enough socially, civically, politically, and economically, and understand how those forces mix, they can then apply pressure in different realms to get what they want.
Well, I mean, there is a precedent with all this cancel culture bullshit. I just feel like, again, things that technically don't matter, are what's being canceled.
Yeah, and that's by design, I think. I think there's people that actively pay good money to keep bullshit in the news as distractions, to kind of keep things, a good word is obfuscated. It's kind of keep things confused, right? Kind of keep people questioning maybe their perception about some things, maybe keep them on the fence about stuff, just keep enough doubt. And that's what the whole, conspiracy theories with the Q and all of this stuff is. It's these are all things to just sow enough doubt in people's minds about kind of the realities of different situations.
Right.
To maintain a control over narratives and whatever.
Just basically blur the line.
Yeah, and I mean, I hate to point out Q as single them out, because there's tons of other, it doesn't matter what side you're on. You're going to have groups within that where they believe things that just are simply not true, but they are security blankets, kind of stories you tell yourself to comfort you about reality, because if you don't believe those things, then certain things just don't make sense, into your reality.
Right.
And people, religiously, politically, whatever, believe in stuff like this. So you have to understand that as well. But in hope that most people as a mass can be, collectively reasonable. But that's why education is important. It's just on us to do that. It's on the people to do that. Nobility don't want that. A monarchist person at the top doesn't want that. They prefer everyone be docile and follow what they want. So, yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to rely on them for instruction in that realm. So when it comes to education, when we talk about education, it doesn't mean necessarily learning one topic. It means understanding the dynamics between politics, economics, religion,
social structure,
civics, you know.
Very broadband.
Yeah, exactly. All of these things are interconnected. And when it comes down to it, though, like, you know, something achievable that we could do when you're talking about lobbyists, right? What's interesting to me about the lobbyist conversation is you could, if we had enough people educated on this, you know, that we could do consumer boycotts, you know, certain brands, certain big corporations, you know, understand really interconnected communication among consumers, understanding how brands are treating their people. And if we found out that a brand was paying well below market, you know, for their, you know, new employees or maybe even older employees, we could, as consumers, say, we're not going to buy from that brand until they rectify this policy, right? You know, we can protect each other as people, you know, and it doesn't mean we have to cancel this company. We have to put them under. What it means is applying some pressure, because they'll see that and be like, oh shit, we don't want our bottom line affected. So we should probably do something about this. And if it was a real threat, it was something that was tangible that people could make happen.
You would see the change.
You would see change. And two, you might even see some businesses, some big corporations that obviously take in billions of dollars, you know, every year. You might see them starting up some organizations themselves that do lobby for the rights of, you know, more average citizens, right? You might see that, because think about the goodwill that would generate with people,
right?
You know, the brands, like, if a brand was doing that, it'd be like, oh shit, you know. And if it was an honest effort too, because, you know, obviously there's tons of things people put out there that they put a nice title on. You know, it's like, you know, the Saving Kids in Africa Fund, right? They could say it could be called that, but then none of that money actually ever goes to kids in Africa. It could, right? Like, there's tons of things that have nice titles, but once audited, you see are just kind of is actually bullshit. So that's the point I'm making. That's what education is when you're being told something, is being able to be like, okay, well, like, prove then what you're saying. Like, is this actually the, you know, money for Kids in Africa Fund? Like, are you actually sending money to them? Like, you need to be able to understand enough to ask those questions, and two, also having a civic structure among the populace that can communicate and be trusted. You know, that's so many things now when it comes to on the mainstream level, is everything's so divided politically. So it's like, if you're listening to one person, it's just like, oh, well, then somebody has a problem with that person because X, Y, and Z, because of their politics. So then it's like everything, and this is the point, and this is why it's like, I think people like that, right? Because you keep dividing everything, so you can never kind of get that consensus of like, oh, well, a consumer consensus against a company or a corporation. And so it's like, always politicize it, always make it something. So you divide everybody's attention, you divide everyone in half. And so I feel like that's, something that you see.
And that in of itself is such a distraction anyway.
Yeah, you know? For sure. Yeah, exactly.
If I'm worried about you on the other side, I'm not really going to focus on the issue per se. It's just really more fuck you.
Exactly. It's out of sight, out of mind. You know, you just keep them focused on some entity, some other thing. You know, again, like dangle a carrot. You know, just put something. You know, it's said. You know, obviously Plato's allegory, cave allegory. You know, it's the shadows on the wall. You just keep the shadows on the wall. They're the ones making the shadows. Right. You know, and you're coming up with and getting mad at the shadows, but it's like, who's creating these. So that's what, you know, that's really how a lot of stuff operates now. But, you know, again, like we always talk about education, that being the thing, and like knowing this stuff, which you touched on, that I've been rambling about for like 20 minutes, was, you know, he is exposing that stuff in this writing. Is he's talking about that frankly and talking about how it is, like, this is how you need to behave. And so if we understood the dynamics as a society better, I think you would see more organization and more progress being made in the realm of people's rights, workers' rights, and things like that, and consumer rights. And
I think the approaches would be better. You know what I'm saying? Because, okay, and again, I'll preface with not to say this is like a righteous approach, but again, we've already like established that there is no like, personal morality applied to this context. You just need to do what you need to do to make the shit happen.
Yeah.
With obviously limits.
Yeah, and on a personal level, as a person, you can still be a moral person, right? Like within your personal life,
exactly.
and like people you should talk to. But when it comes to dealing with different power elements when you're in power, nobility, the people,
right?
Perhaps if you are a part of the nobility, perhaps the monarchist or the leader, and I always say monarchist because they're representing that aspect of the republic, right? Mm-hmm. So the leader, and so it doesn't matter who you are. He's writing it to the prince, right? Mm-hmm. He's writing it to the leader, but it doesn't matter who you are. You understand how it's all like all these dynamics intertwine. Even if he's just talking about the leader, even as the populace, the person. One of the people can understand this. One of the nobility can understand this and apply this stuff and use this stuff.
And I mean, like, shit. I'd say I'm definitely a proponent for that because, I mean, think about this. If people were kind of like almost like no holds barred on like just getting some right shit done, like let's say like some woman's kid like died because some car ran over one of the potholes or one of the many potholes in downtown, and some freak accident or a hubcap flew off and like clipped her kid or some shit like that, and she just decided to like balls to the wall get on the government for like, yo, y'all don't fix the roads, you know what I'm saying, across the board. You only do the nice neighborhoods and then you leave other neighborhoods to shit. Like what the fuck's up with that? But then obviously the mayor is like, well, we only have so much money for this. We only have so much money for that, blah, 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 blah. And let's say homegirl gets like desperate enough to where, as opposed to trying to go through like the right lane, she just blackmails a motherfucker.
Right. Right.
It's like, yeah, it was shady, but you still got the roads fucking cleaned up. And now they're nice now. But it's like, sometimes that's what it takes to get, you know what I'm saying, to get shit done.
Yeah. And well, like part of what I'm, sort of talking about too, like is, there are these think tanks, these sort of like, which are obviously funded, heavily, private donations from
private interest,
whoever, whatever groups, in circles are affiliated with it, any number.
Your average can't afford that.
Any number of industries, like there's so much of this stuff.
Your average can't afford that shit.
Right. Average people don't have something like that. They don't have really a big think tank. And if they do, but they're really not funded like that. Well,
properly,
so it's like one of those things of like understanding that stuff, if we had kind of sort of those better organizations that, and people, there was more, again, like more unity in terms of agreed upon mission and how to approach this stuff, because there are stuff like people we could all achieve that is doable. But a lot of the times I feel like some of this stuff is like promise stuff that's just so outside of the realm of reality because it just, that in of itself just causes so much chaos. When you suggest something that's just like, well, that's ridiculous. And then people would be like, well, actually, it's not that ridiculous. And here's why. And then, but like, it's always ridiculous. And it's like, you're making excuses for bad ideas. And
exactly. Plus, like you were saying earlier, it's a give and take. So if your idea being that outrageous, if the government or the ruling party is actually able to give you that, at some point in time, there's going to be a take. Now, are you willing to pay that price?
Yep. Exactly. Because what are they trying to get from you? There's always something.
Yeah,
nothing's ever free. Even if they say it's free, it's not free because somebody's paying for it, either money wise or with a favor down the line. And a favor usually is not something that you have a choice over. Right. So yeah, it really matters. All of this stuff. So yeah, like that's why I wanted to do a deep dive into it, because
dude, now you got me thinking about this vaccine shit.
Oh yeah,
because you're saying if nothing is free, how is this shit free?
Well, yeah, and then you see about like how a lot of that stuff works too, and like how like the medical establishment has responded to this stuff. Like some of that has been kind of Machiavellian in some ways, right? in terms of like, Fauci comes out and says, oh, the masks, you don't need them. They're more performative than anything. Like they just, it's a cloth mask. It's, and then, obviously, months later it's saying, oh, we definitely need a mask.
You need a mask,
it should be mandatory. And then at some point was even talking about using 2 masks. And so like, it's one of those, and then people came out and then they were like, well, why did you walk that back? And Fauci says, he's like, well, we wanted to save PPE supplies for the medical workers. So in this context, and now if we're going to apply Machiavelli says, well, some situations you need to be dishonest if it's the good of the stability of the people, right?
Right.
And so, Fauci, whether or not that's true
of that situation,
like
right.
whether or not he's actually telling the truth that like that's why he said that, or if he genuinely believes, is the way he comes off. I mean, it seems like he genuinely believes that they don't do anything in the interview. Honestly, it's like he's either the world's greatest actor or like, he actually believes that. I don't know. It's hard to say, but in that sense, like what he tried to sell it narratively as a Machiavellian move. Well, I was dishonest to help the stability of the state maintain PPE supplies, right?
That's good. Damage control,
right? Right? And these guys aren't stupid. And that's what I don't like about a lot of the narratives about, like, it's just everything keeps it so childish a lot of the times it's just like, they're so dumb. They don't make it's like they're not dumb.
They're
they know
supposed to
what
be
they're
the best
doing.
among us, yeah.
They know what they're doing, and they are very smart. And that's the thing you need to be worried about, is that they're fucking clever, and they're too clever. And a lot of the times they really want to do some weird, possibly dangerous stuff because they're clever, and sometimes too clever for their own good. I don't want to, besmirch the good name of Anthony Fauci too much on the podcast here and get like fucking booted off the internet. But you see, like, that's a good example, of him applying that to that situation.
Very
and
much so.
It's this stuff it's what's so fun about Machiavelli. And to me, I know people will be like, oh, history's so fucking boring. It's just like, dude, it's like, it's really not. It's like because you read this stuff and you start to understand what the fuck's going on around you. It's like, what the hell? You start to see how people use this every day and how it can be useful to you possibly in your career and everyday life. Everyone's got fucking agendas, and who knows who's got, it's hard to judge people's intentions, especially like oftentimes evil people aren't obvious.
Exactly.
There's a reason why those people get into positions of power and do bad things. And you see it in history. Those people get into positions of power, do bad things because they're likable and they make allies and they do these things that Machiavelli talks about.
They play the game right.
Exactly. And then once they have that power, they start shutting all the doors to any ways to get them out of it. And surround themselves with people that, will help maintain that power structure. And, talk about, in particular, a guy that did that, more obviously notable example, Hitler.
I was just thinking of that, dude.
Yeah, dude.
I was just thinking.
Machiavelli does talk about, I believe he talks about it in the discourses, is starting a war on 2 fronts. He talks, just don't do it. Mm-mm. Don't fight 2 wars.
Spread thin.
You can't do it. He warns against it, and that is the mistake that Hitler makes in World War II. Hitler pulls a lot of Machiavellian shit. He does a lot of stuff. There's
why would you fight the world though?
Yeah, he's start fucking war against the world. It's one of those things, man. It's some fucking delusion, but man, it's incredible too, because you can just, these guys throughout history, you can look at different leaders, you can look at different situations, and even if those leaders aren't aware of Machiavelli's writings, you can see how his writings apply, and you can see it. All of the patterns that he's recognizing, they're all over history. It's just, and this is why he's important. This is why he's remembered. This is why he's relevant. And this is why I wanted to cover him. And so, yeah, I feel like, that's probably a good place to wrap up the discussion.
Yeah.
But I feel like, we hit a lot of main points that I wanted to hit. So yeah. And let's get your thoughts. What do you think of, about this topic?
Oh, no, I think it's excellent. Like, again, it just helps with comprehension as far as like looking through that lens of quote unquote politics, and just like sometimes, if you don't know enough, it looks like, wow, this shit's kind of fucked up. Like the world's fucked up. It's just fucked up people leading us blindly around, blah, blah, blah. But once you actually, look at it through that lens, or the Machiavellian lens a little bit, with comprehension, it makes a little bit more sense. It doesn't seem as fucked up as just more so practical.
Well, yeah, and some of it doesn't seem necessarily so random, anymore, or it doesn't seem so like you're saying, like sometimes it does just seem like just fucking a bunch of sociopaths just feeding at the trough of greed. It's like, well, just to get it. It always sounds like so pretentious, when people just kind of go that route, because like there are, like we've talked about, there are good people that are in the system that are trying to work it, but the problem, obviously comes down to a lot of these situations we talk about is education, man. It's really the key. Like if more people knew about this stuff and we encouraged education versus allegiance to
nationalism and fucking blue or red.
Yeah, it's just ideology, understanding that, individual education is really what empowers people, that people element of the Republican dynamic. Yeah. And, everyone, obviously, I believe we touched on it earlier, but like Republican not meaning
right, the Republican Party.
It means somebody who believes in the form of government. Still applies today. That structure, not apples to apples, but
close
contextually,
enough.
You can put that framework down, and it's a good lens to understand things, because it really does delineate those powers in a way that helps you understand just on a basic level, because obviously things can get much more complex than that. Obviously, but it's a starting point that if, as a whole society really focused on that and understanding those dynamics, who knows what could be achieved in terms of progress, of social progress. Because what you see happening right now, it's almost like nobility, people in power, the elite, whatever you want to call them, they want people to act as crazy and stupid as possible, because that gives them an excuse to behave in increasingly authoritarian ways. So, hey, yeah, man, like encourage people to be fucking wild and go storm into the Capitol, or like go fucking encourage people to go fucking riot in the streets and go burn shit down. It just gives the state an excuse to go fucking control you. That's what it is if we understood restraint, if we understood that level, don't give them a fucking reason. Don't give them the fucking reason in the first place, and that's what it comes down to, that's where the education comes in, is there's power in restraint, is the people have tons of power. If anything,
the power.
They really do have all of the power, and the people as a whole do show tons of restraint, but I think that is largely due to the pacification by things that elite, nobility, whatever you want to call them, do, is with all the distractions that we've talked about. This is all pacification techniques, the ways to keep you, keep things stable and running.
It works.
Because people get desperate enough, people will go fucking crazy. But that's also another thing. There's just like they're kind of turning up this pressure valve just enough to get people fucking wild and go do crazy stuff, so that they can do because you can't push them too far. You can't push everybody over
without
the brink,
reason,
because then there's a certain line you're not coming back from, right? You push people too far, then it's like, okay, now you have too many people against you. Again, you don't want to be fucking hated, so they're dancing on that line. You know what I mean? I see. That's the game it looks like they're playing right now. Is they're dancing on that line because they want to they want that excuse to be more. They need more control. They're like, all right, well, you guys, you obviously can't handle this. We gotta regulate this more.
Yeah, dude, the vaccine is like all this vaccine bullshit is a perfect example. They keep trying to push that whole mandate
It's compliance
across.
test almost.
And it's like, you're getting pushback, and it's kind of like, okay, never mind. The federal board said chill out, but then next month, it's gonna be Omicron 13 or some shit like that, or Galaxy, I don't know, whatever another stupid sci-fi name is.
Omega,
yeah, and then there's gonna be another. Oh, it's getting crazy now. We really gotta push that vaccine in there.
Oh yeah, we're gonna need 5 shots. It's like it's just gonna keep. We're gonna need boosters. I mean, don't get me wrong. If you're in a certain age group and you really do, believe in the protection that the vaccine will give you, then hey, go for it. Go make your choice. Like, I'm not at all saying you shouldn't do that.
I feel like every single person should have a choice. Period. In the story.
Go for it. Even if you're younger, go for it. It just seems like if you're younger and you're healthier, like it doesn't really affect you that badly. So whatever. Like it doesn't fucking matter that much anymore. But when it comes to older people, like obviously the death rate there is higher, and so it's like there's probably some concern if you do come down with it. Probably a good idea to get it. I don't know. I'm not the fucking expert.
Me neither. But you're right, though. It seems like
if they came out with the traditional, if came out with a traditional vaccine formulation, like attenuated virus, like they've done in the past, like I'm not.
Oh, you mean like the definition of a vaccine?
Yeah, like the traditional. Yeah, exactly. Like that's what I would prefer. Like if they came out with that, I'm all for that.
Yeah,
but
it takes about 5 years.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm waiting.
We're waiting.
I'll wait for that. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to these boosters and stuff, like I've talked to a lot of people in my age group, is like a lot of people are like, look, they got me for one shot. I was up for that, but look, I'm not going to do this continuous booster thing. Like they're obviously it needs work. And so I'm not just going to keep dumping stuff into my body if it's like unnecessary. Most people I know in my age group haven't gotten it. The ones that have, some have needed to be hospitalized, but, they, got some of the therapeutic treatments and we're back on their feet. Cool. So at this point, there's so many therapeutic treatments that have become available because honestly, there's an economy of fear.
Exactly.
There's big money in keeping people scared. So, do what you can. Like we always talk about, do what you can in your personal life to keep yourself at your personal level of safety, like your acceptable level of safety, like what you feel you need to do is best. But trying to sort of police what other people do, like it starts to become an issue. Certain situations, it can be reasonable, but in this, it's not no longer reasonable in these situations. A lot of things need to get fucking going again, and it can't be. It's just like everyone worried about this. There's a pathology to it almost at a certain point. People are just scared, and it's just and always thinking about it. And it's just like you think about what the psychological effect might be on some people, for the
exactly if you just believe in it enough.
Yeah, or even kids growing up, just like everything's always about this fucking virus, and just thinking about that, like, man, like, how long do we want to keep this going for? But anyway, yeah, off topic, talking about the virus vaccine.
Dude, I mean, again, it was not off topic. That was literally like another point of like you don't want to push the people too far. That's why they're not mandating anything. That's why they're not going ham with it. You know,
it's a great point. Exactly,
they're still borderlining it.
Yeah, exactly. You make a great point there. It's like they kind of try and take that mile almost, it's like, or even take it like because honestly, the mandate to me is more than an inch. So they kind of just try and it's one of those, we talked about this a little bit. I don't think on the podcast, but negotiation tactic of asking for more than you want.
Actually,
and so you can, when you negotiate it back, you'll be like, okay, well, maybe not everybody gets the mandate,
but just federal workers,
right. And so they kind of just start moving the goalposts back. But the thing is like it's this initial ask thing. It's like it's always going to be this outrageous fucking. That's going to be turned down, obviously.
Yeah, it works.
But it makes people think that they're getting something when you and they walk it back. But it's still you're still getting basically what you wanted in the first place. Like they know what they're doing. These people are fucking smart, you know? And so, yeah, it's important to be aware of these dynamics.
I'm sure it applies.
Yeah.
For sure.
So yeah, I'll do the wrap up here.
All right.
For the end of the episode. We're on social media, on Twitter and Instagram. I don't update them too much. I mean, I haven't been fucking around on the internet too much. We also have a new podcast, Casturbation, which isn't actually a new podcast. It's an old podcast that we rebooted. It's comedy, pure comedy. And I kind of felt like I wanted to divide up, you know, historical, the original run had the mixture of, you know, academic with the comedy element, right? It's like you're learning something, but we're still joking about it. And, you know, I think it worked for what it was, but at the same time, drawing those two things apart now, like having Casturbation just being that comedy outlet, just like, that's just going to be the self-indulgent. We're going to joke, you know, and be stupid. Like really, a lot of it is just absolutely stupid shit, but it's, you know, just supposed to be fun. And this to be like more I don't want to say intense, but like, you know, actually dig deeper into the intellectual side of stuff versus like just kind of joking about it. Because honestly, there's jokes to be made. You know, we'll still make jokes. I'm not against jokes, right? But like we'll encounter them through the material.
Right. It'll be natural.
Yeah. Genuine jokes here. Not going to force any bullshit. So we're just going to try and talk about interesting, hopefully relevant stuff that informs people today and what we're doing here. So yeah, go check out Casturbation if you just want the funny, but stick around for HistoricHole if you like want the story about history and all of that. You want the real story, because we don't sugarcoat it here. We're like Machiavelli. We're just talking about how it is. But yeah, that's it for this week. See you next time.
Peace.